The county treasurer pushed the auction papers across the table. You know why nobody bid on this property? Sarah Whitmore smiled. I have a pretty good idea. The man tapped the file. 60 acres. She nodded. Mostly brush. Another nod. No road improvements. I know. He hesitated. And according to the survey, he looked over his glasses. Half the land hasn't been maintained in 30 years. Sarah signed anyway. 5 minutes later, she officially owned 60 acres of neglected hillside purchased for unpaid property taxes. Most people considered it a terrible investment. Sarah considered it affordable. That distinction mattered. Outside the courthouse, a local farmer recognized the address on her paperwork. You bought the Hawthorne place? I did. The man laughed. Good luck. Sarah smiled politely. Thanks. You'll need it. The old Hawthorne property had become something of a local legend. Not because anything valuable remained, because almost nothing did. Years of neglect allowed cedar, blackberry thickets, briars, wild grapevines, and young hardwood trees to swallow nearly everything. Old fence lines disappeared. Pastures vanished. Buildings collapsed beneath vegetation. Even longtime residents couldn't remember exactly what the property originally looked like. Several investors inspected it over the years. None bought it. Clearing the land with heavy equipment would cost a fortune. Sarah didn't own a fortune. She owned goats. 112 of them. For years, Sarah operated a successful targeted grazing business. Instead of mowing difficult terrain, landowners hired her goats to remove invasive brush naturally. Utility companies, parks, private landowners. The herd worked constantly. Goats climbed places machines couldn't. They loved blackberry vines, poison ivy, multiflora rose, honeysuckle. The thicker the brush, the happier they seemed. While driving home from the auction, Sarah couldn't stop smiling. Everyone focused on what the land lacked. She focused on what it had. Brush. Miles of it. Exactly what her goats preferred. Friends questioned the purchase almost immediately. You paid money for that. Sarah nodded. It's cheaper than leasing pasture. But it's unusable. For now, most people imagine bulldozers, excavators, massive clearing projects. Sarah imagined portable fencing, water tanks, goats, lots of goats. The first week looked overwhelming. Brush stood well above her head. Some blackberry canes reached nearly 12 feet. Cedars crowded every opening. Walking 50 yards often required fighting through dense vegetation. Finding old property boundaries became nearly impossible. Sarah divided the land into small grazing sections. Portable electric fencing enclosed the first acre. Then she released the herd. The transformation started almost immediately. Leaves disappeared first, then vines, then smaller brush. The goats stripped invasive plants with astonishing efficiency. Each week the fences moved. Another section opened, then another. The work required patience. Goats didn't clear land overnight. They simply showed up every morning and kept eating. Sarah appreciated that approach. One steady bite at a time. By autumn, the first 15 acres looked dramatically different. Sunlight reached the ground again. Old stone fence rows reappeared. Wildflowers emerged from soil untouched for decades. Native grasses slowly returned. Neighbors driving past began slowing down. Not because the property looked finished, because it no longer looked abandoned. One afternoon, an elderly woman stopped beside the gate. She introduced herself as Helen Crawford. My parents knew the Hawthorns. Sarah invited her inside. Helen walked slowly through the partially cleared fields. Every few minutes she stopped. I forgot this was here. She pointed toward an old orchard nearly hidden beneath vines. Several apple trees still stood. Neglected, twisted, yet alive. Farther uphill, they found crumbling stone walls. Then fragments of an old wagon road. The land seemed to remember itself. Before leaving, Helen paused. You know? Sarah looked up. There used to be a well somewhere. A well. Helen nodded. Beautiful stone well. She pointed vaguely toward the northern hillside. My grandfather watered horses there. Sarah glanced toward the dense wall of brush. Nothing looked remotely like a well. Helen smiled apologetically. Could be anywhere now. The conversation lingered in Sarah's mind. That winter she studied historical aerial photographs. The oldest images showed open pasture. The stone wall wasn't visible. Still, old wagon routes appeared. One seemed to disappear near the hillside Helen mentioned. Spring arrived. The goats returned to work. Another 20 acres disappeared beneath eager mouths. Blackberry tunnels collapsed. Young cedars vanished. More forgotten features emerged. Sections of split-rail fencing, foundation stones, an abandoned livestock pen. The property slowly revealed its history. Sarah began carrying orange survey flags. Whenever something interesting appeared, she marked it. Visitors increased. Some came because they'd heard about the goats. Others simply wanted to see abandoned farmland returning to life. One local conservation group organized a field walk. Children watched goats balancing effortlessly on fallen logs. Parents asked questions about invasive species. The project became unexpectedly popular. Still, Sarah wondered about the well. Months passed without finding it. Perhaps it no longer existed. Perhaps Helen remembered incorrectly. Then one cool September morning, something unusual happened. The goats refused to leave one particular patch of brush. Normally they spread quickly through fresh vegetation. This time dozens gathered around a small area halfway up the northern slope. Sarah assumed they had discovered especially good blackberry vines. She walked over carrying fencing supplies. The brush looked impossibly thick. Wild grapevines twisted through cedar saplings. Blackberries covered everything. The goats worked enthusiastically. By late afternoon, sunlight finally reached the ground beneath the vines. Sarah noticed something gray. Not a rock. Too smooth. She pulled away several branches. Another stone appeared. Then another. Perfectly stacked. Circular. Carefully fitted. Her pulse quickened. She called a neighbor helping repair fencing. Together they cut away more vines. Slowly, an enormous circle of hand-laid limestone emerged from beneath decades of growth. Neither spoke for several moments. The structure looked remarkably intact. The opening remained covered by old timbers and soil. Whatever lay beneath had remained hidden for generations. Sarah brushed dirt from one weathered stone. Someone had carved a date. 1887. She suddenly realized Helen hadn't simply remembered an old well. Her goats had uncovered one of the oldest structures on the entire property. And when they finally lifted the remaining cover 2 days later, everyone standing there fell completely silent. Because deep inside the forgotten stone well, something impossible shimmered in the darkness. The flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness. Then something reflected back. Not metal. Water. Clear, still water. Far below the stone opening, the forgotten well remained full. Sarah knelt beside the weathered limestone wall. The water looked remarkably clean. A cool draft drifted upward from the shaft. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, her neighbor broke the silence. "I can't believe it's still holding." Neither could Sarah. The well had been hidden beneath brush for decades. Yet the stonework remained almost untouched. The hand-cut limestone blocks fit together so perfectly that very few gaps had opened despite more than a century of weather. The carved date, 1887, now seemed even more remarkable. Someone had built this to last. The following week, Sarah contacted the County Historical Society. Within days, historians, engineers, and a groundwater specialist visited the property. The inspection took hours. When it finally ended, one engineer smiled. "I've seen newer wells in worse condition." Sarah laughed. "So it's usable?" "It appears to be." Tests began immediately. Water samples went to laboratories. The stone walls were carefully examined. The surrounding hillside was mapped. Several weeks later, the results arrived. The groundwater tested exceptionally clean. The spring feeding the well remained active. Somehow, decades of dense vegetation had protected the structure rather than destroying it. The discovery changed everything. Not because Sarah planned to drink directly from the old well, because reliable water transformed possibilities. The northern section of the property had always been difficult to graze. Water access limited livestock movement. Now she had options. Working with conservation specialists, Sarah restored the stone well carefully. Every original limestone block remained exactly where it belonged. Broken capstones were replaced using reclaimed local stone. A protective wooden roof, matching historical photographs, was built above the opening. Nothing looked modern. Everything looked as though it had always belonged there. Meanwhile, the goats continued working. Another season revealed even more forgotten pieces of the old farm. Terrace garden walls, an abandoned smokehouse foundation, sections of stacked stone fencing. The Hawthorne property slowly emerged from beneath the brush like a forgotten photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. Visitors became regular guests. Families walked marked trails. Local schools organized field trips. Children loved watching the goats strip blackberry vines from impossible hillsides. Adults became fascinated by what appeared afterward. History hidden beneath invasive plants. One autumn afternoon, Helen Crawford returned. Sarah guided her toward the restored well. The elderly woman stopped halfway down the path. Her eyes filled with tears. "I never thought I'd see this again." She walked slowly around the circular stone wall, then rested one hand against the cool limestone. "My grandfather watered every horse here." Sarah smiled. "I'm glad you remembered." Helen shook her head. "No." She looked toward the hillside where goats continued grazing. They remembered. The sentence stayed with Sarah long afterward, because it felt true. The goats hadn't discovered treasure. They simply removed what didn't belong. The land revealed the rest. As the property improved, neighboring farmers began asking unexpected questions. Not about the well, about the goats. How many animals did she use? How long did each pasture require? Could brush really be managed without heavy equipment? Sarah invited anyone interested to visit. She showed before and after photographs, cost comparisons, pasture recovery, native plant return. She never claimed goats solved every problem, but on steep, overgrown land, they proved remarkably effective. The county conservation office eventually partnered with Sarah to demonstrate targeted grazing projects across the region. Abandoned hillsides became productive again. Old orchards returned to sunlight. Native grasses replaced invasive brush. The goats became minor celebrities. Children even recognized them at community events. 3 years after purchasing the 60 acres, Sarah climbed the highest ridge at sunrise. She paused where dense blackberry tunnels once stood taller than her head. Now open pasture rolled gently across the hillside. Wildflowers covered the slopes. Butterflies drifted through native grasses. The restored orchard produced fruit again. The old wagon road had reopened as a walking trail. Below, the stone well stood quietly beneath its cedar roof. A young family filled reusable water bottles from a modern spigot supplied by the restored spring system nearby while reading a small historical plaque explaining the well's story. The well remained protected, its history preserved, its water respected. One morning, the county treasurer stopped by unexpectedly. He smiled as he looked across the property. "I hardly recognize this place." Sarah laughed. "Neither do I." The man shook his head. "When you bought it?" He paused. "I honestly thought you'd overpaid." Sarah looked toward the grazing goats. "They did most of the work. They certainly earned their hay." He laughed. "So what's the biggest surprise?" Sarah considered the question. Most people expected her answer to be the well, or the restored orchard. Instead, she looked across the open landscape. The biggest surprise? She smiled. How much was already here? Nothing truly new had been created. The pasture had existed before. The orchard had existed before. The wagon road had existed before. Even the stone well had quietly waited beneath vines for generations. The goats simply gave the land room to breathe again. Years later, visitors often asked Sarah how she found the hidden well. She always smiled at the question. "I didn't." Then she'd point toward the hillside where another herd quietly worked through thick brush. "The goats did." People usually laughed, then realized she meant every word. She paid back taxes on 60 acres nobody wanted. Everyone else saw thickets, briars, and abandoned ground. She saw feed for her goats. The goats saw blackberry vines. One bite after another, they peeled away decades of neglect. Underneath waited a forgotten stone well, a spring that still flowed, and a farm that had never truly disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to uncover it.